Strength and love particularly to the people in the Grampians region, a region of Victoria. They are still recovering from the bushfire that's been there over the past couple of days. There's a particular part I want to shout out though, which is Pomonal. And this is an area that's got just about 356 people in it. It's about 3 and a bit hours out from Melbourne, and it's part of the Grampians. Well, they suffered the bulk of the bushfire, and many properties have been destroyed, and also in this area there's been a loss of life. Now today there was footage that was being released via the Herald Sun about just how devastating this particular fire was. Now it is a later bushfire season, but it seems to still have all of the impact that it would be if it was right at the height of summer. Instead it's towards the end of summer, but the victims of all of this, well, they've lost an awful lot. Now, the locals, of course, will have to do their bit to try to rebuild. But again, as always, when there is natural disaster and something bad happens to our fellow Aussies, we give them the spotlight.
There was a bit of a roar and embers coming down before we left. So there would have been spot fires everywhere, trees catching light. It's hard to take, but as I said, we've got our arms around each other and the bond is strong.
Now, the Premier of Victoria has also offered her thoughts.
There is some priority being given, obviously, to the community of Pomonal, so the rapid assessments are being undertaken there. There are people who spent last night in a relief centre not knowing if they've got a home to go back to today.
But there is a story that is connected to all of this. It's one I've spoken about in the past, but it's one that has come back as a result of what Victoria is dealing with right now. And it's something that the Fire Brigade Union and its representative are trying to call attention to, which is that there are massive problems in Victoria right now with the equipment that the Victorian government gives firefighters to be able to fight fires. The United Firefighters Union boss has said on Tuesday that the state government needed to address the catastrophic state of firefighting resources, which pose untold risk to the community and firefighters. About 60 fire trucks in the metropolitan Melbourne area, about more than 15 years old. They've got cracked doors, old engines and rusted roofs. More than half of the truck's fleet have passed their use-by date and continuously fail in operations. They are removed from service only to be put back in service because there are no replacements. Bit hard for the people who fight the fires to do it with old equipment. Peter says the situation is so catastrophic that on a day-to-day basis, Fire and Rescue Victoria faces the current problem of being unable to keep critical frontline appliances on the road without faults or failures. Now again, we talk about this a lot, what politicians do versus what they say. And they all love standing up there and giving the press conferences pretending that they are the ones who are in charge of the emergency response. Reality is that they're often emceeing these press conferences with the real people who know the information, or they're simply reading off a collection of notes. They don't know what's going on. But one thing they absolutely have control of is how they spend taxpayers' money. And if the Fire Brigade Union, which is a fairly left-wing union, is telling us that there's problems with the equipment, can somebody somewhere in the Victorian government actually buy new equipment? Stop finding excuses to recycle and send it out, because we don't want a scenario where, God forbid, a firefighter ends up dying and it's a coroner who ends up having to learn what the Firefighters Union, and we've been telling you for some time, watch what they do, not what they say. Meantime, about those power losses, which are still quite significant across big parts of Victoria. Now, of course, as you know, the towers fell over, which meant the transmission lines went out, but equally so, the over-reliance on a grid that hasn't been built to replace it means we're in a scenario where still about 174,000 people don't have power tonight. If you're watching us, you're obviously doing so via something powered by batteries, and we appreciate that you have tuned in, including anyone who's watching us right now on Sky News Regional, however you can do that. The wild weather resulted in the physical collapse of 6 transmission towers. Crews are actively working to restore the power in these affected areas. However, given the extent of the widespread damage, it may take weeks, we are hearing, for it to be restored. Meantime, there's another idea that came out of some bushfires that were in Western Australia while most of the country, and certainly the media, was on holidays. There were some particularly bad bushfires that were there and were a national show, so we'll talk about all parts of the country. And there was a really interesting idea that was raised today out of some of the difficulties that happened in those fires in Western Australia. Now, the suggestion is that people who have some form of a disability or are people who are considered to be vulnerable, that somebody needs to check in on them when things like the massive power outage that's happening right now in Victoria, has happened in places like Western Australia, happens into the future. Now, obviously, we would all hope that there's a family member or a neighbour who ends up knocking on the door. But interesting story from this one bloke in particular. His name is Gary Paul. And Gary is a man who suffers with vision difficulties, I believe, is legally blind. But he has suggested that there should be literally a list put together of vulnerable people in any community so that some form of an authority, when the power goes out, will be able to go and check that these people are okay. And Gary says, they didn't know about me being legally blind and can't drive. Across the whole community, there's a hole. We've got to look at it, mainly focusing on vulnerable people. Now, he's in Kalgoorlie. Now, apparently, the Kalgoorlie Local Council has no plans to put the list together, but someone somewhere should be putting lists like this together because, again, while we'd all love to believe that it's our neighbours that'll be there for us, there are people who are largely left alone, and in a disaster scenario or when the power goes out for a few hours, somebody like Gary needs someone to double check and make sure that he is okay. So it's a good idea, and one that I hope local councils, if that's the group, start putting those lists together sooner rather than later. Now, last night I told you that 53% of Australians, despite all of the noise in the political media, have virtually no or absolutely no knowledge about the too little too late tax changes that this government has introduced to try to save their bacon. Now, the numbers are so small it's not going to change anyone's life, but it's about changing their politics. So what's going to happen? Well, enter other people's money, the favourite source of money from governments who want to prop up their own political fortunes. And today there was a Senate estimates hearing where Katy Gallagher, the Finance Minister, was forced to reveal just how much money is going to be spent of taxpayers' money to tell other taxpayers that the too little too late tax cuts are much bigger than they actually are.
I think it's, we've agreed, I think the decision of government is to agree to a campaign of up to $40 million over 2 financial years in relation to the tax campaign. But that hasn't been finalised.
I couldn't help but think that the Finance Minister was in an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm and she's realised, oh, I said the thing I'm not supposed to.
I think it's, we've agreed, I think the decision of government is to agree to a campaign of up to $40 million over 2 financial years in relation to the tax campaign. But that hasn't been finalised.
Thank you, Larry. Now, let's get to just the size of this amount of money which is being spent totally for politics, right? There is literally no other reason that you need to be told about tax. Remember, it's a relationship between you, your boss, the tax department, and then you'll be able to see your tax return at another point in time. But $40 million to spin the political nature of the too little too late tax changes is pretty offensive. In fact, the opposition was briefing people today that that is more money than they spent advertising the NBN back when they were last in government in 2012 and 13. That was $21 million. It's twice as much to tell people they're getting a $14 a week tax cut. The Gonski reforms in education, well, they spent $15 million telling everyone how amazing that was. They're spending $40 million on the too little too late tax changes. And then even when they said there wouldn't be a carbon tax and then there was a carbon tax, well, of course, they had to advertise about a carbon tax, and that was $12 million. So literally double the amount of money on the carbon tax, virtually double on education, and definitely double the amount of money that they spent to pitch their own NBN. let me save the government $40 million. The tax cuts are 4/5 of bugger all. Now, while they will try to tell you what you will save annually, the reality is that you don't pay your tax annually. You pay it whenever you get paid. You pay it by the week, by the fortnight or by the month. The reality for people in Australia, and yes, I'm going to show it again, is that if you earn $45,000, forget what the ads tell you, you will be saving a grand total of $15 a week. You will be able to keep $15 a week of your own money. Labor MPs told that this was the solution to cost of living. That's why I call it too little too late. And even if you're somebody on $40 a week, let's be honest, $120 a month is not going to be anything when it comes to, say, paying off your mortgage, which you know is tens of thousands of dollars more than it was thanks to the interest rates that have gone up under this bloke's watch.